Let me begin by thanking IDSA Uttam for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here at this conference amongst all strategic experts. So I was told that earlier the sessions were fairly passionate and with a lot of emotion. Hopefully this session will calm everybody's nerves. And it will, although there is some passion that Dr. Xi Sheng has already introduced into the session, and some of the opening remarks made by the chair, Dr. Bhatia. And what I will say in the time that has been allotted to me, I pretty much concur with a lot of things that have been said by Mr. Bhatia, as well as my co-panelist, Dr. Xi Sheng. There, it's ready. And before I delve into the PPT, let me say a couple of things that I made notes of while in the beginning. So the shift towards Asia, as documented by, if you look at Madison's tables, the secular change in GDP over 2 centuries, you will notice that India and China in the middle of the 19th century were contributed about half the GDP, and you're going to get the same picture by the middle of this century, hopefully earlier. By 2035, India and China will contribute, well, if not half, close to half of the GDP. So clearly, the projections are that India and China will become big players in terms of GDP. Whether that will translate into the kind of soft power that Dr. Xi Sheng has mentioned, whether that translation will happen quickly or easily, or at least equitably, is a question that I don't think I have answers to at the moment, but the process is on in terms of multilateralism, in terms of the international financial institutions, in terms of rulemaking that Dr. Bhatia spoke about, and the governance. All those changes are underway, and whether that will happen, the jury is still out there, I guess, and the process. Anybody, I mean, be it developed countries, be it developing countries, if you look at within India as well, the ability to give up or renunciate something that you've had, or renounce something that you've had for centuries is a difficult task. And I think it will not be easy for this. The shift in GDP is, to my mind, as an economist, it's easier to say that the shift in GDP is easier to occur. The commensurate shift in the soft power might take a little more time in coming, but I hope it's at least equitably done. The other point that was made was the role of global value chains in the new economic order, and I think that's extremely important. On the one hand, global value chains can only flourish when you have open economies, especially because you are integrated. And one of the demonstrations of that in the data, if you look at economic data, you will see that the fluctuations in GDP over the past few years have been less than the fluctuations in trade volumes across the world. And so it's been a non-linear kind of causation. I don't know whether the causation is from GDP or trade, or there's something else happening because of protectionism as a result of the financial crisis. So I'm hesitant to talk about the correlation, but the causation, but the correlation between volatility in GDP and volatility in trade is there in the data. And one of the striking features of the last few years has been the volatility in trade is more than the volatility in GDP, and that's striking because one answer to that is because of the pervasiveness, at least in certain regions, of global value chains. And if global value chains are going to become what they are, they will need open economies to leverage the splicing and dicing of production value chains across the globe. So I think global value chains are extremely important, and I'll talk a little bit about what India needs to do towards the end of my talk, if I have time, towards the end of my talk, what India needs to do to participate in these global value chains, because as most of you will know, at least through reading of newspaper articles, India's participation in global value chains is quite pathetic, to use a blunt term. It's pathetic, it's abysmal. I mean, we are hardly represented in global value chains, except in certain sectors like pharmaceuticals and in auto components. But at the high end, in the other sectors, we are essentially non-existent. The third point that was made, and then I'll get into my presentation by Dr. Bhatia, which pretty much sums up my the presentation that I'm going to make, is China and India in regional integration, in Asian integration, and the story that I'm telling in the presentation, and I'll just start, is that for India to benefit from participation in regional networks or foreign trade agreements, to really benefit from them, there's a lot of homework that we need to do, and that homework is what Dr. Bhatia referred to as domestic reform, and or which manifests itself in external competitiveness. So if you're not competitive, then you can pretty much kind of not expect to see as much gains from open trade or free trade. So it's then pointless blaming that this FTA has caused trade balance or trade imbalances, and therefore we should not engage in FTA. So that's, I think, looking at completely the wrong end of the stick. What we should be doing is focusing on domestic reform and then leveraging the benefits of either, whether it's regionalism or multilateralism, and Dr. Bhatia referred to this, where are we headed, whether we are headed to regionalism and multilateralism, what is better, whether one is a route to get to the other, or whether they are kind of contradictory forces. There's a lot have been written, especially since the 90s, and one of the most famous pieces is by Jagdish Bhagwati, is whether they are stumbling blocks or whether they are building blocks. As a pragmatic or practical matter, regionalism is here to stay. Multilateralism, I guess, is here to stay. Though at some point we've had the Bali Agreement, and there are some plurilateral agreements being discussed in the WTO. So multilateralism is also there to stay. So I think we'll have a balance of both regionalism as well as multilateralism. So India to kind of continue to say that we've lost out from regional trading agreements and we've lost out from free trade agreements, I don't think that's I'm not saying it's whining, but I don't think that's a fair assessment of what the potential of FTAs is, because if we engage in domestic reform, if we put our own house in order, the so-called Ohio principle, own house in order, then I think we'll have much more benefits from regional trading agreements. So that's those are my introductory remarks, and I'll keep coming back to these aspects in the presentation. The paper that we've started writing in ICRIER, and this is with my colleagues and young, smart colleagues who are sitting in the audience. I don't know whether I should point them out because they might feel a little embarrassed, so I won't point them, but they are in the audience. My two colleagues, Samriddhi and Devyani, and essentially this is a lot of the work. This is work in progress, and we are in the process of completing this. One draft is ready, but I think there will be, based on what happens today and based on other presentations that we make, I think there will be scope to revise and improve the conclusions of this paper. I won't go through each slide in detail. The slides are here, and the paper is in the packet for those of you who are interested. But essentially, since a lot of you may not be familiar with the kind of framework of economics or the framework of comparative advantage, so on. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about it, but I'll skip through essentially a lot of the other slides. The main argument that we're making in this paper is that when you talk about comparative advantage, essentially, or competitive advantage as business school professors like to call it, I mean, there are some differences, there are some nuances, but competitive advantage or comparative advantage is based on various things, endowments, skills, labor cost advantages, location, R&D, technology that Dr. Shisheng mentioned, technology, productivity, all these contribute to your comparative advantage, and comparative advantage can be, static as of today, or it can be dynamic. You can kind of get comparative advantage over a period of time. And FTAs, the reason I'm bringing this up is that FTAs are a method to kind of get dynamic comparative advantage, not through supporting particular industries like Japan and Korea did in the past, which has been there's been a lot of debate on industrial policy, picking winners kind of story, but it's not really picking winners, but providing the right kind of environment for your country, for your firms to leverage in the future, and therefore become competitive over the long term. So you can have comparative advantage today, or you can have comparative advantage in the future. And the reason I'm saying this is because just because you're running a trade deficit with a specific country today, i.e. India is running a trade deficit with China, doesn't mean that that will be perennial, or that is permanent, and that's like the Northern Star, it will not change. We can change it, and the way it can be changed is through generating dynamic comparative advantage for your companies by providing the competitive pressure that trade does provide. One of the reasons that automobiles, auto components have done so well in India post-liberalization in 1991 is precisely because of that reason, the competitive pressure that was provided by imported components and imported equipment and imported parts, and therefore the Indian industry was able to then become competitive over the long term. It didn't happen on its own. There was rational, right-thinking policy that was introduced. You can calibrate that policy, but right-thinking policy was introduced to make sectors like auto components competitive over the long term, which is what I'm calling, or what we're calling in this paper, dynamic comparative advantage. This is kind of slightly different from the approach that Korea had adopted in the past, or Japan had adopted in the past. This is, before you become, let's say if you're part of a multilateral arrangement, it will be much more difficult to pick winners, in a sense, to support, let's say, the semiconductor industry that Korea did, or Taiwan did. You subsidize. And the reason I'm mentioning Taiwan is because Christy, my colleague here, is on Taiwan, and ICRER as an institution, we've done a very large study along with Christy's institution on the feasibility of having a free trade area between India and Taiwan. But today I'm going to talk about a free trade area between India and China. So it's not the picking winners story. It's a story of domestic reform, as pointed out by Dr. Bhatia, pretty much providing a kind of all the infrastructure support to industry so that flourish, or they can do well in not in a static sense, but in a dynamic sense. So, I've talked about all of this, so I'll get into the meat of the paper. So what we look at is what is the kind of trade, what is the pattern or specialization of trade between India and China, and so what is the kind of overarching picture. There's this trade deficit that India has with China, and China, of course, obviously China runs a surplus. China not only runs a surplus with India, but also with a host of other countries. And I was quite intrigued. In fact, I was quite surprised by the number that Dr. Shisheng mentioned in his presentation, that China is the largest trading partner to 124 countries in the world. That's a significant number. That's a very large number, and so it comes as no surprise that India is also, in fact, China is India's largest trading partner, and we run a trade deficit with China, and that trade deficit is to the tune of roughly $40 billion. Now, that brings up a lot of passion and emotion, especially amongst policymakers. Not amongst, I guess, the producers or manufacturers engaged in that trade as much as it does amongst policymakers, amongst commentators. And one very common helicopter view or the criticism of a trade deficit is that India is running a trade deficit with China, and therefore the knee-jerk reaction is, let's go out and protect ourselves from Chinese goods. Now, those of you who are familiar with India, who follow India a little bit, there are many festivals that take place in India. India is kind of a religious, spiritual, whatever you want to, how you describe it. And so people are aghast when some of our gods and goddesses at important festivals are made in China and imported. And so that's the kind of image, the picture that gets built up. Even our gods, Ganeshas, that is very popular in a festival which comes around November, October, is made in China. And so that raises, the heckles amongst people and say we should stop importing with China. So this is precisely the question that we asked ourselves, and so, okay, let's look at the 6-digit level, look at the pattern of trade that India has with China, and what do we import, what do we export? Are the newspaper stories true? Are we importing lights and candles and Ganeshas, or is there something more that is happening with China? And lo and behold, the answer that we get, and we'll be happy to be corrected on this, that the trade with China actually largely constitutes intermediate goods and capital goods. And if you tell me that that's not good for India, then I don't think we are practicing good economics. If we are able to import cheaper from China, and you can safeguard yourselves from all the security concerns that you have, and we should, I'm not saying we shouldn't, all the security concerns that we have, we should safeguard ourselves, and then do the study, and we find that intermediate goods and capital goods are our dominant source imports from China. And this is at the 6-digit level. And likewise, we are not just exporting consumer goods to China, or just raw material to China, raw material export to China. So this is that colonial form of trade. You export raw materials without adding value. China does all the value added and exports. We're not even doing that. So China is not even importing all raw materials from us. So our trade with China, I think, in intermediate goods and capital goods reflects, I think, at one level the differences in the size of the two economies. They are 4 to 5 times our size now, and they've grown much more rapidly in the past. In fact, I must make this point that there is no country in the world that has grown for as long a period as time, for over 10% in the history of, since economists started calculating growth rates. So that's quite an achievement to grow at. And a lot of economists would say that the numbers coming out of China, Dr. Xu Sheng will be able to comment on this. People were doubtful or suspicious that these numbers coming out of China are accurate or not. But economist after economist has demonstrated that China has indeed grown at very rapid rates, and it still remains the fastest growing at 7.5%, 7.7%. It remains the fastest growing country in the world. What's the point that I'm driving at, and what is it that we're driving at in this paper, is it reflects bilateral trade deficit. It's not a very meaningful estimate for policy, and I'll share with you in a moment why. Running a bilateral trade deficit with China of $40 billion or whatever it becomes in the future, I don't think it's a meaningful metric for policy purposes. Just because we are running it doesn't mean we clamp down. Of course, there are political economy reasons. I'm speaking from an economist's perspective. And moreover, it just reflects the differences in the size of the two countries. And then we said, okay, if it raises so much of angst amongst policymakers, if this is a reason to be protectionist, or if there's a reason to be closed, let's do a comparison between India and Pakistan. And for those of you who are familiar with India's relationship with Pakistan, it's been tumultuous. It's always very passionate, emotive, and so. But we looked at the economics between the trade between India and Pakistan, and we find that India runs a large trade surplus with Pakistan, just like we run a large trade deficit with China. We run a large trade. It's only one country. We've just chosen a country for the sake of comparison because of the emotions it arises, and also because ICRIR is engaged in a very large project trying to normalize. And that's the other story I'm going to tell, using trade as an instrument for generating peace. But I'm hesitant to make this comment in IDSA, but I don't want to push this too much, right? But that's not the story, that's not the main story I'm telling in this. But running a current account deficit is with a specific country is not a sign of weakness. Running a current account surplus is not a sign of strength. Within certain parameters, and I can give you examples of a lot of developing countries that should run a current account deficit in the interest of future growth, import technology, import capital goods. Just like Japan ran a current account surplus for many countries, many years, but it was showing very low or negative growth. Current account surpluses simply could be an indication of lack of investment opportunities. A current account deficit could, I mean, you could, if you break thresholds, if you go beyond thresholds, then it could become weaknesses. It could be a weakness. But just to infer that from running a bilateral deficit with one country that our trade we are not doing well with respect to China, and the same story holds with Japan, and same story holds with Korea for us. So we are running bilateral trade deficits with Korea, with whom we signed an FTA in 2010. We are running a bilateral trade deficit with Japan, whom we signed an FTA. And therefore, the conclusion is do not sign any more FTAs. Be very careful about signing FTAs because you'll run trade deficits. So that's the kind of policy implication of the analysis. Missing the point that, you're trading with the entire globe, in the entire world, and when did our exports pick up post 1991? When did we become? Today we export $300 billion. In 1991 we were exporting, a few $billion. Why did our exports pick up? Of course, growth has happened, but one of the reasons exports picked up is because the import content of our exports is very high. Ask Dr. Xu Sheng, and he will tell you in China, the domestic value added in exports may not be very high because you import and then you export, and that's how you become competitive. So you are, if you want to export, you will have to have a liberal import regime. Otherwise, self-sufficiency is not enabling for promoting export. So that's, and the disaggregation is all there at the 6-digit level. I don't think I'm going to go over all of this. All of the data, it's there for you to see, and I'll be happy to engage in a floor discussion at the end of it. But given China's kind of size, given China's trade openness, it's not surprising that we are running a trade deficit. However, that should not be an impediment or a constraint if India wants to sign an FTA with China. Are there any benefits of India signing an FTA with China? There will be substantial. We haven't done the kind of CG models that economists do, but we could do that. The potential I had pointed out in my early slide is about $100 billion of trade between India and China. That's the potential. It could grow even more. But apart from, I think, the benefits of the magnitude of trade, the other benefits of cooperating closely with China in the economic environment that you are in today is that if multilateralism is not working, if there is a pivot towards Asia, if the global value chains are shifting towards Asia, if production is shifting towards Asia, and more than 50% of the GDP is going to come from India and China, then it makes sense to engage, or at least to try and think about an FTA between India and China, because then the benefits could multiply. The other benefit, as I said, which I'm hesitant to say in IDSA in front of strategic experts, is that, trade, and there are articles by Baldwin, famous economists, that countries that engage are economically more interdependent. I'm going to say this carefully because there's a very precise way in which it's been said. Economic interdependence is a causal factor in reducing the probability of conflict between two countries, or between two regions or two countries. So in this case, two countries. So the probability, so greater economic interdependence is a causal factor in reducing the probability of conflict between two countries. So that could be, another spillover. But in economic terms, between India and China, given the size and given the fact that we have not even begun to look at services in which India enjoys a comparative advantage, and if the FTA could become an economic agreement which includes not only goods but also includes services, then the benefits for India, of course, all those linguistic barriers, cultural barriers, of course, one will have to overcome all of that. But given that India's comparative advantage lies in services, and we have a services agreement as well, I mean, this is, you're looking at 20, 25, 30 years down the line, then an FTA or an economic engagement with China could be beneficial for both countries. I've just got I'm going to say a couple of more things again, and then I'll conclude by talking about the need for domestic reform in India, and then I will stop. I'll take just a few more minutes, Chair, just a couple of more minutes. If you look at, and this is, I've already said this is evidence for something that I've already said, which is that most countries that trade with China will run a trade deficit. And which are the countries that stand out that are running trade surpluses with China? Well, the countries, you can see the countries. There are very few countries that run trade surpluses with China. Well, New Zealand is one of them. This is just very few. This is not the sample of 124 countries, as you can imagine, that Dr. Shusheng spoke about. But India runs a trade deficit, and a number of other countries run trade deficit with China. The few that run a surplus are there for you to see. And then India runs a trade deficit with most countries, but with Pakistan and Singapore, India runs a trade surplus. And Pakistan is the example that I had given earlier, that India enjoys a trade surplus with Pakistan, and naturally it will because of the size and of course greater competitiveness. But that doesn't mean that Pakistan should be averse to liberalizing trade with India, just like India should not be averse to liberalizing trade with China in case we do think about greater engagement with China through an FTA or an RTA. Okay, the story about peace or trade as an instrumentality in generating peace or lowering the possibility of conflict, that is, I mean, some people agree with that, some people don't agree with that. But if you do go back to the history of the creation of the European Union, 1959 Treaty of Rome, the basis was to avoid conflict, greater trade, and the basis for the Treaty of Rome was, the premise was greater economic integration with the interest of generating peace in the region that had been devastated by war. So there is a precedent, and I'm not saying that is the only reason we should do that, but it could be another reason to engage in greater economic interdependence. Trade itself is useful, as many people would say, but if you get these added benefits, then that's the icing on the cake. I want to conclude by talking about something that my thoughts were provoked by what the chair said right in the beginning, is that we can do all of this economic trade integration, economic integration, but domestic reform is essential. And those of you who live in India, those of you who follow India, would recognize the difficulty or the political economy difficulties in generating more reform, second generation reforms. A whole host of reforms are necessary in India. Economic reforms are necessary in India, and I can't even begin to think about where to start from, but I'll just tell you a few, since the finance minister just spoke about presented his interim budget. Fiscal deficit, current account deficit, high inflation, high growth, inequality, spreading growth to various reasons. We talk to a lot of foreign investors. Japan is sitting, waiting to come into India. They are investing billions of dollars in the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor, waiting to come into India, and they've been asking for simple things like get your infrastructure in order, get your power in order. Why do we have to Why do we have to invest in captive power plants? That just increases the cost of doing business. As it is, the cost of doing business through increase in transactions costs in India, according to the World Bank, is 135th in the world. And there are these other impediments in terms of, interrupted and erratic power supply. So you have to then increase the costs of owning captive power plants for big business. And your trade facilitation or your clearance procedures, environment clearance procedures, they're all riddled with rent-seeking, the economist term for corruption, riddled with rent-seeking. So all those problems. So we have to, transparency, governance, infrastructure, labor markets, manufacturing. There's a whole host of domestic reform, what economists in India call second-generation reform. We've done some in 91, and we've done piecemeal since 91 to 2010. We've done some piecemeal reform, but I think deeper economic reforms, structural reforms are necessary in India in the coming years. Apart from the governance reforms, deeper structural reforms are necessary. If we're going to, find ourselves, as we keep patting ourselves on the back. Jim O'Neill, who coined the terms BRICS, that term BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and I was thinking of replacing that I with Indonesia. So it will remain BRIC or the BRICS, but I from India to Indonesia. And the reason is that, from spectacularly high growth rates, we've come to spectacularly, and the decline has been as spectacular, from 9% to 4.5%. In a matter of a few years is a spectacular fall in the rate of growth, and part of the reasons, as I said, is due to the lack of domestic reforms in India. So I'll just conclude by saying that if we can do the domestic reform, then the benefits of regional integration or integrating with China or with Taiwan or with any other country, I think will be a lot more to leverage as we unleash the forces of competition in our economy. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.